My name's Martin Hinshelwood. I'm a professional Scrum trainer with Scrum.org, and also a Visual Studio ALM MVP, which makes me sit in a little weird world since most process guys hate the tools guys, and most tools guys hate the process guys, but I kind of have to hate and have arguments with myself. And I want to talk a little bit about building big teams with Nexus. Has anybody heard of Nexus? Two down the front, awesome. So I want to just clarify what specifically I want to talk about, because I want to be very specific. I want to say that Scrum, well, I knew there was going to be a lot of engineers, so Scrum is just an implementation of the Agile base class. It supports one team. That's what Scrum's for, one team. That's the way it's designed. And there's this thing called Nexus, which inherits from Scrum. So it is still just Scrum and then adds a few extra things that we need. So we're really talking about this idea of more than two teams and one project. That's pretty key. If you've got one team and many projects, you're just in a painful place. There's not a lot of help for that. You get a project manager, you figure it out. There's too much going on. You're not going to get focus. You're not going to get good delivery. If you've got many teams and many products, you're probably looking at portfolio management. I'm not going to talk about portfolio management. That's something that does have to happen, but I want to talk about the kind of engineering side of that. So Nexus sits in this sweet spot of actually, well, 6 plus or minus 3, same as team size in Scrum. So kind of 3 to 9 teams working together on one product. You can do stuff with more, but that's the bit I want to talk about just now, just to clarify that. So a little bit about me. I'm from this little place to the north of England, just above England. I did not vote for Brexit, in case you were wondering. Although the group below the border decided that it was a good idea to do, to get off the train, which is just, I don't think it's going to be a good idea, but there we go. That's the politics out of the way. But luckily, most of my customers are not in the UK. Most of my customers are kind of distributed randomly across the world, which is kind of fun. And it's interesting because the world has changed a lot in the last 20 years. Anybody know Adam was going to be here, Adam Cogan, and he said he was going through my deck and helping me out, and he said you have to have a history section so that people set the context for people that don't know it. But we've been using this thing for many years. Some people call it waterfall, Maurice, SSADM, depending on what you learned at university. It's been around for many years. It's always been a bit of a fallacy. And in 1993, Scrum came along. The first Scrum team was Life Critical Systems in the Netherlands with CMMI level 5. That's a long time ago. So it's not a newfangled thing. And then along came XP because a lot of people failed at delivering with Agile, whatever flavor implementation of Agile you were using, Scrum being the most predominant one. We failed at the engineering practices, so XP brought in a lot of those engineering practices that are absolutely awesome. We need those things, but it still didn't quite get us there. So around, I think ALM's been around for quite a while, but the terms were coined around the early 2000s. Application lifecycle management was talked about a lot. My MVP used to be called an ALM MVP. I think they're probably going to call it DevOps at some point, but they've just not changed it yet. Or Visual Studio ALM, HP ALM, all the products popped up and kind of stole the term. But then it still smacked of this waterfall thing, because ALM didn't mean Agile. ALM just meant, kind of all the things that you need to do. So this term DevOps kind of came along in 2008, and it's the Agile flavor of ALM, as it were. So bringing in all the processes and practices around everything. And it depends who you talk to, what DevOps means to them. Yeah? I think of it as everything. We've got creating ideas all the way through to delivering software. Other people just think of the engineering piece to get software out the door, but it's really used in all of those places. So it's one of those co-opted terms. But it didn't seem to help. It helped some teams, some organizations, but things kind of didn't work out well for many people, because you had a CEO who heard about this DevOps thing and says to people, let's do DevOps, and then it's just supposed to magically happen. My favorite one for that was, we must do unit tests. I was in an organization in the US, and I had an argument with the lead developer about what unit tests meant, and she was absolutely adamant that unit tests meant pressing F5 in Visual Studio and clicking through the web app. That's a unit test. But the reason it meant that was because it was very difficult engineering-wise to implement unit tests for them. Management wanted unit tests, therefore redefine what the thing is so you can say that you're doing it. Yeah, that happens a lot with all of these terms. Scrum very often as well. There was an interesting report that came out a few years ago, the Chaos Report from the Standish Group in Boston. I can't give you the actual report because it costs loads and loads of money, but I do get a copy through scrum.org, which is kind of nice. But some interesting things came out of that report. One was that large teams get much more benefit from moving to Agile than small teams. I thought that was fairly interesting, because most people believe, or the colloquial belief is that, Agile's great for small groups of people, but when you get lots and lots of people together, now you need project management and you need PMI and all of those things. It's not true. These guys actually found an inverse relationship between value delivery and PMI, which I also thought was very interesting. You're less likely to deliver value that way. Customers are happiest if you don't deliver everything they ask for. That's kind of a slap in the face, isn't it? Because we want to deliver them everything they ask for, but the reality is that customers are happiest if you deliver what they need just now. Not everything they asked for 3 years ago when they came up with the idea for the project. So that was pretty interesting. And it's clear that waterfall doesn't scale. It doesn't scale to large teams, depending on what large teams means for you. Large teams for Richard here means 80 teams working on one product in, 12 locations in 9 different countries. Yeah, that's a large team. But when they say large teams, they actually mean more than 50. If you've got more than 50 people working on one product, you sit in their large category. So that's the 600% potential improvement. And something fairly interesting that to us, I think, if you're at a developer conference, this will be fairly obvious to you, that skilled teams are more than 200% more likely to succeed than unskilled teams. That's a kind of no-brainer for us, but it's quite a revelation for management, especially when you think about Taylorism and traditional management, where you're all replaceable cogs. And if we burn out our developers, we can just get more developers. It doesn't actually work that way. We know that, but it's kind of a revelation. So I want to cover a few things. I want to talk about why other scaling frameworks have failed. Most scaling frameworks deliver in some cases and don't deliver in other cases. So kind of why is that? What's the rationale behind that? And then I want to be able to use Scrum to scale Scrum, because we know Scrum works. Scrum does work. If you go and look at organizations who are implementing Scrum well, they are doing well at delivering software on the one team basis. So how do we take that benefit and scale it up a little bit more? And then I want to talk about some complementary practices that you need around both teams and work that are kind of critical to that discussion at scale. So they're very specific to scale. You can use them on the small scale as well, but they're very specific to scale. And then just how, a run through of how does Nexus kind of go together and what does it provide us? So why haven't they failed? Well, there's this little thing called culture that we have in organizations, and every organization has a different culture. And you can't, I had this conversation with somebody, it was actually at Agile in Africa, and we were talking about that you can't change culture. Culture is a shadow of the way you do things in your organization. So you don't change culture. If you try and tackle culture, you're always going to fail. Change the way you do things, and culture will follow. That's what you focus on. So I've got a little thing for you here. So let's say I have this axis of people-orientated on the left all the way over to company-orientated on the right. Think about where your company might sit on that line. Is your company more corporate, or is it more people? You know, far on the left might be Netflix and maybe Spotify, probably sit over there. Far on the right, most banks, not all banks, but most banks, sit far on the right. You thought about where you are? Okay. What about if I drew this axis? Innovation at the bottom, all the way through to kind of reality-orientated. We're dealing with what is happening just now versus thinking about what's going to happen in the future at the bottom. Where does your organization sit? Do you do more R&D and thinking about the future, or on a day-to-day basis, do you spend more time, well, potentially fighting fires, but working in the now? You thought about where you sit? Cool. Okay, so if I put those two together, we actually come up with this interesting model. It's actually called the Snyder model. I don't really care about the model. I'm using it for illustrative purposes. But we have 4 quadrants. On the top right is we succeed by getting and keeping control. That is the belief in that top right-hand quadrant. So that's about order, power, predictability. All of those things boil down to this control world. And you're never at 100% control, but you might fit somewhere in that section if you thought you were actuality and impersonal in your organization. At the bottom right, we succeed by being the best. I know a lot of organizations that's their mantra, and that's about craftsmanship and professionalism and achieving as individuals. That's competence. We are competent at what we do. Now, you're never going to be 100% in any of these categories, but you get the idea. We succeed by working together. That's the collaborative, but partnership and people. And our last one is we succeed by growing people who fulfill our vision. Somebody like Netflix is down here. They don't think about anything other than their people in order to grow that vision. And it's about creativity, dedication, having faith in your people that they will do the right thing and do those things. So, where did you guys sit on this graph? Was it here? A couple of people going, yeah. Well, but you're thinking about, yes, I'm in control. I'm thinking about that exact spot, that exact percentage of competence, control, collaboration, and cultivation. I bet you were somewhere else on that picture. You might have been all the way up in the top right in control. Yeah? Or you might have had a little bit more control and less collaboration in your organization. Or you might have been all the way over in collaboration. My point is that every single company is different. Every company culture is different, and no 2 companies are in the same place. Does that make sense? So, if you're going to go on a journey and change, where are you going to go? Are you going to go here? Is that where your company wants to go? They want to move towards collaboration? And are you going to get there in a straight line? No, it's never going to happen. You're never going to get there in a straight line. That's unicorns and rainbows and fuzzy things. And even having an idea of where you're going to go, we want to get to that exact spot, is irrational as well. You're not going to get there. What's going to happen is you're going to figure out what you're going to do next to get towards your goal of where you would like to get to. You'll take a step, reassess where you are, and figure out your next step. So you end up with more of a meandering journey, and you end up where you end up. You might not end up where you expect to end up. Does that make sense for everybody? Yeah. Kind of makes sense, because everything's different. We know our people are different. We know all of those things are different. So what we'd like to do is have some kind of framework. Instead of having a methodology that defines how we should do everything. I don't know if there's any safe talks at the conference? I don't think so, but if you've looked at the SAFE diagram, it's this massive diagram that has a job for everybody. That's not what we want to do. That might be what you end up with at the end of your journey because that's what your organization and that's what your culture wants, okay? But I don't want to force you to use particular practices. You need to choose which practices are best for you. But something is very important, and I'm going to be very adamant about this. If you don't have to scale, don't. Scaling is a very expensive prospect, hugely expensive. Unless you have to do it, don't. Because would you expect if I add 2 teams, I get twice as much work done, twice as much value delivered in my product? What about 3 or 4 or 5 teams? Am I going to get 5 times as much value delivered in my product with 5 teams as with 1? I think you'll find it's not really a linear progression if you actually tried to do it. And you kind of end up more, there's a point of diminishing returns. And in some organizations, they end up having a worse effect of adding more teams. Because things get too complicated, you end up in chaos. So we're delivering less. So before you scale, there's 3 things that you want to make sure that you do before you scale. Whatever process you pick, whatever framework you pick, do it well. So I would say do Scrum well. Be able to follow the rules, understand why they're all there, and follow them. Okay? Step 2, enhance your teams. Focus on both people and engineering practices that they need to be awesome. We're going to need all of those things. We're going to need automation. We're going to need leadership. These are both just as important on our teams. And the 3rd step is have some kind of guiding values for your organization so that we don't do the wrong thing. These are the Scrum values that were added to the Scrum Guide last year, July 2016. They were implied in the Scrum Guide, but they weren't physically in it, and they decided to add them, and they're in the 2nd paragraph now just to make sure that everybody knows they're there. So we take those 3 things. Mechanical Scrum, we're following the rules. Technical excellence in doing our job and figuring out how to do it well. And values and principles, and we put them together, and we can say we're professional Scrum teams rather than just amateur Scrum teams or cowboys or whatever it is that you have right now. And most teams in most organizations that I go into are not professional teams. They end up sitting in that amateur category. But I would caveat that to say that I don't go into organizations that are doing awesome, because they don't generally call me. Yeah? So I have a very jaded look at what organizations are doing. And something that you should, I've highly recommended read is Jeff's book, Twice the Features in Half the Time. He talks about what it takes to take a team and deliver more value, augment that team into a high-performing team that can deliver lots of value. Because the reality is that the only foundation for scale is professional teams. You can't scale with amateurs. If you take 5 amateur teams and put them together, you're just going to get a bigger mess than you had to start with 1 team. Does that make sense for everybody? Cool. So just to reiterate, 1 product, many teams is what Nexus is focusing on solving. That's this thing that is the augmentation to Scrum that enshrines the basic framework that we need for many teams working together. Okay. So, Nexus. Ken likes to call it an ectoskeleton around Scrum. I like it's inherits from Scrum and adds some extra methods and properties, but then I'm an engineer and he's the Scrum Lord, as it were. And there's 2 things that are really important in this world of Nexus. One is Backlog, and the other is Dependencies. You're going to have dependencies between teams. That's just reality. We can't get away from that. We want to minimize those dependencies as much as possible. And in order to do that and to have it transparent and open, Nexus introduces some new roles, new events, and new artifacts. Everybody here familiar with Scrum? Anybody here, you all familiar with Scrum? Awesome. So you will know that every role is there to provide accountability. Every event is there to provide empiricism. And every artifact is there to provide transparency. That's why they're there. That's why missing out on one of them is kind of bad, because you lose one of those things, and we want empiricism, so we keep changing direction. We want transparency, so we know what's going on, so we can change direction. And we want accountability, so somebody takes ownership of that thing. Yeah, but we need to add a little bit to it. So this is the next, yep, this is the Nexus diagram, which kind of looks like a Scrum diagram. It should, because it is still Scrum. We've just added some extra things to enshrine the communication lines and the things that have to happen in order to deliver software at scale. Because we're still building one incremented version of our product, one integrated increment. So at the end of every iteration, we have one version of our software. Not 9 if we've got 9 teams, because that doesn't work. We've still got more things to do. There's more work there. So there are things that we're forced to do. For example, refinement is no longer optional. Some Scrum teams can get, if you're working on a reasonably straightforward product that everybody really understands, you might be able to get away without doing refinement. But if you've got 9 teams working on one product, refinement is no longer optional. When we do our sprint planning, we might have teams across multiple time zones. So they're not all happening at the same time. That's just reality. Hopefully, each of those teams are co-located, so the members of a team are co-located, but we have teams spread across time zones. So we maybe need a group of people to get together before those events happen and discuss dependencies and figure out, what we can and can't do in this next iteration, because things are dependent upon each other. And then they need to take that information back to the teams. So I think of these little Nexus boxes, which actually appear all over the place, as a team of teams. They're representatives of the development teams that get together, figure out those dependencies, and take that information back to the team for their sprint planning meeting. And then we have this idea of a Nexus sprint backlog rather than just a sprint backlog, because, well, we've got 9 teams and we want to see all the work underway, not just one team's work. So each team should be able to see their own work, but we need to be able to see everything that's going on in our Nexus. And we are talking about 3 to 9 teams. Just like performance tends to tail off after 9 people on a single Scrum team, same reasoning behind it for the communication lines on multiple teams working together. You can have multiple Nexus, or Nexi, or Nexuses working together, depending on which dictionary you use, what the plural is for that. So there's a lot of things going on there. But there are only a few extra pieces. So we have a Nexus integration team to provide an additional level of accountability. We need somebody, a group of people, accountable for integrating the software, accountable for making sure that all of the Scrum teams think about integration, because we forget, yeah? And then we get to the end of this, oh, well, we didn't talk to this other team that's doing something in the same area, and now we've got a bunch of conflicts. Maybe we should have thought about that earlier. Who's there to make sure that those discussions happen, that people think about that? That's the Nexus integration team. So we talked about Nexus sprint planning. We've got a Nexus daily Scrum, because if we're trying to figure out what happened in the last 24 hours, maybe some of that is dependency problems. Maybe builds were failing or unit tests were failing because 2 teams weren't talking to each other. So maybe we need a quick Nexus integration meeting before individual Scrum teams take that information back to the Scrum teams. We only have one sprint review, and it's been renamed from sprint review to Nexus sprint review because it's one event reviewing one piece of software. You're still reviewing one piece of software. It's not 9 different pieces of software. We've got the retrospective. Refinement is added as an actual event because we need that moment of inspection and adaptation. And in artifacts for transparency, we've got the goal, a Nexus goal, because we all need to be going in the same direction. We can't be going, if we're all working on different things, where are our discussions relevant? That's why you have a sprint goal inside of a Scrum team. Because if you don't have a sprint goal and you just pick 5 random things off your backlog to go work on, your team's all working on different things. Why would they need to talk to each other? They're not even working in the same space. Whereas if we have a goal and select things from the backlog to achieve that goal, then we're all focused on delivering inside of the same space. So when we talk to each other, it's relevant, we can share ideas. Same at the Nexus level. Let's maintain some of that at that level as well. Yeah? So I want to add some complementary practices because there's common problems that everybody has when they start scaling, and we need some complementary practices. So if you download the Nexus guide and read the Nexus guide, the complementary practices will not be in the Nexus guide. Just like user stories are not in the Scrum guide. That's a complementary practice. You can choose to do that or choose to do something else. That's okay. So the first problem is building effective teams. We've got 1 team in our organization. We need to scale up to 5 teams because we've got to deliver more value in our product than we can currently deliver. So how do we do that? There's 2 main practices that I think work pretty well. The first one is you put 1 team together, you make them awesome, and then you split them, end up with 2 teams, build up the numbers. So as you go, you maybe start with 3 people, 4, 5, 6. When you get to 9, you add the 10th person. Maybe we can split that into 2 teams of 5, and then those teams start getting bigger, split them, grow, split, grow, split. That's one way to do it. That's been pretty effective in the past. You kind of lose your high-performing team every time you split, and they have to work together to make that happen again, but it can be quite effective. Another model I've seen is an internship model. So you have a team of people who are very good coaches, a group of people who are just good at that sort of thing, and you have them on a team, and then you cycle people through that team to learn what's going on, and then they spin up their new team, the new team as they come out. Does that make sense? Cool. Those are 2 potential practices. There may be many, many more that you have discovered online or you've tried yourself to do. Whatever works. Complementary practices. The other thing that's super important to think about and that is going to be key to being successful at scaling is not getting everything happening at once. He does get up at the end. See, look, get up. You've got 3 things. You've got teams, work, and architecture of your application. They need to be aligned. If they're not aligned, you're going to have problems. So another key practice is being able to adjust those things. If those 3 things aren't aligned, you're going to get friction, and it's going to be hard to deliver working software. The architecture of your application, the work that you've got to do, so your backlog breakdown, as well as the composition of the teams. Don't be afraid to reorganize the teams in order to match up to the architecture. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's pretty difficult. So once we get into our backlog, we then have one of our biggest problems is backlog dependency management. There are all sorts of techniques. I couldn't get that to go any faster. It's a bit slow. You've got too many things happening, and everything has to happen in the right sequence. If it doesn't happen in the right sequence, you're going to stumble. Yeah? And you've got to go and fix it. If we can find out those dependencies earlier, then we don't have those stumbles. And it shouldn't be that difficult to do. We just have to sit down, get in a room, figure it out. Figure out what those dependencies are before you start. So identifying those dependencies and dealing with them. You might have cross-team dependencies. You might have component teams where you've got a database team, a middle-tier team, and a front-end team. You're going to have a lot of dependencies. Pretty much everything of value is going to require work from all of those three teams. So figure out how to break those things down and decompose those backlog items for those things. I would suggest reconfiguring into feature teams might be a better idea. Yeah? But minimize dependencies as much as you can, identify them early. Because there's all types of dependencies. You might have dependencies between people. You've got this one person that's the only person that can do a particular job. You might have domain dependencies. I know particularly I've got some customers are here, and they have particular domain-specific stuff all over the place. That makes it difficult. You might have technology dependencies, software. You might have third-party software that you depend on. You might depend on a third-party company or somebody else to do something. It's pretty difficult. I already mentioned feature teams. Feature teams are by far and away the best way to remove dependencies. If you've got a full-stack feature team that can deliver, you can give them a piece of value, something your customers want, and they can deliver it full-stack in your application, then they don't have any dependencies outside of their team. The team can work together to figure that out. Can you think what the next problem might be? Actually creating integrated software. It's hugely difficult because what happens when you go to try and merge? Yeah, you end up with a mess if you've not organized it beforehand. I have customers that have branches that exist for 2 years and then they try and merge them back into the trunk, and it's like, what are you doing? It's not going to work. And no, they haven't been pulling the changes through. So it's just a big mess. So we have this idea in Nexus of an integration team. Now, an integration team is not a dedicated team in Nexus world. Ideally, it's not a dedicated team. I have seen that. I have seen that work. But ideally, it's representatives from the teams. They are the people in your organization who are the DevOps coaches, just coaches in general, engineering experts, maybe TDD experts, or creating CI pipelines. They work normally on the teams that they work on, but they get together to discuss things, resolve dependencies, figure out what we need to do across all of the teams to be able to resolve those dependencies. So it's coordination, raising awareness, ensuring integration happens. Does that make sense? Because if you have a dedicated team, why would the development teams care to solve any of those problems? Because it's their problem. I have a very specific customer. They have a dedicated build team, and the build team solves all of the problems. So all the developers are like, yeah, we'll check in whatever crap we like, and if it fails, they'll fix it. Yeah? You want to try and avoid that? You know who you are. So we have this integration team, and they generally operate as working in the team. Now, sometimes messes happen. Sometimes there's a fire, and we have to go deal with that fire, whether it's the build failed or there's some kind of severe priority 1 bug in production that we've got to specifically organize around solving. So maybe in those circumstances, they pull out of the teams, get together, form a team in order to solve that problem, and then they go back to their teams. It's not their permanent mode of operation. It's temporary to go solve some problems. And hopefully, when they go back to their teams, they bring up those issues at each team's retrospective, and the teams can figure out how to change your application to not have those problems happen again, or change your process. Just like you would expect a Scrum team to do. Cool. So we talked a lot about teams and people and things working together. We also need to cover a little bit the work, because we've got to get the work in order to be able to deliver. So one of the biggest problems is usually having a backlog at all. You'd be surprised the number of organizations I go into where they have 10 teams working on one product, and they don't really have a backlog, and the teams just make up whatever they like to go do. You'd be surprised. So we need some practices around figuring out what that backlog is, where it comes from, what to do, and we've got an extra event to try and handle some of that. But some interesting practices that you might want to use. I don't know if anybody's used impact mapping. Anybody here used impact mapping? Nope. It's a pretty useful way to figure out what it is that you need to do. You can actually work from either side of this graph. You can either start with your goal and then figure out what your deliverables are, or you can start from a deliverable. I know what I want at the end, so what might goal be? So these deliverables, my favorite one is rob a bank. You want lots of money, so you could go rob a bank. That would work. It might not be the most optimal solution, but it might work. Yeah, bank of mom and dad as well. So impact mapping can be fairly useful. More common is story mapping. Has anybody used story mapping? Yep, a few people have used story mapping. So it's about facilitating breaking down your backlog into something that you can understand. It adds an extra dimension to your backlog, so you can see where things lie, how we might break things down. And that brings us to a very interesting thing that in the Scrum world, we tend to say, don't use tools. You're better with stickies on a wall, because that tactile feel of working with cards helps people interact and feel more ownership of the things in the backlog. And that's true for one team. You get two teams working together, it's probably still true as long as they're co-located. But once you get to 5, or in Richard's case, 80 teams working together on one product, you're going to need a tool. It's no longer good enough to have stickies on a wall, because that would be a big wall. Yeah, if you've got 80 teams working on one product. So you might also need to think about levels of abstraction as well. We might think about, we have business objectives, epics that break down into features that break down into backlog items, because people in your organization aren't going to necessarily be able to understand the amount of work that's involved for 10 teams in PBIs. Maybe your product owner doesn't even care at that level, because there's too much going on. Maybe they're focusing on features. I care about the features that are delivering. You guys, the team, figure out what things you need to go do to achieve those features. And they're kind of bigger. Yeah? So breaking that backlog down so you don't have something that's too big, because it's just not going to fit. It's going to derail the process. So in order to maintain that backlog and break everything down as much as humanly possible, we have this new event called the Nexus Refinement. Refinement was always part of Scrum. It was just kind of, you can do it whenever you like, it's up to you. You've got 10% of the team's time, you figure it out. Now it's, you have to have an event. Because if you've got 10 teams, I'm pretty sure 10 teams cost quite a lot of money. You don't want them sitting around doing nothing or doing the wrong thing. Because there's additional things we need to do in our refinement session. We need to not only look at what's in the backlog, breaking it down into nice-sized things so that we can actually fit them in a single iteration. That would be nice. Having them with enough information for the development team to be able to take them into the iteration and deliver them, that would also be nice. But we probably need to refine those backlog items from a dependency perspective. Are we making sure that we're not trying to do something in sprint 1 that depends on something that we're going to deliver in sprint 3? Because that would trip us up. So having some way to manage your dependencies and have making sure that you know what you're dependent upon. So for example, in sprint 1, the driver team, number 2, is a dependency of 6. You want to make sure all those arrows are pointing from right to left. If they're pointing from left to right, you've got it the wrong way around. Or you might have external dependencies you have to make sure that you remember to take care of. Having some way to identify those things is super important. Yeah? Cool. So, we have this set of teams working together, and we have a number of events that have to happen that are slightly different in Nexus. And the reason they're slightly different is just because we've got more things going on, more things happening. So, we have this idea of a Nexus sprint planning, which is a lot bigger event, because there's lots of people. If you've got 9 teams, maybe in more than one country, maybe you've got 2 teams in India, maybe you've got 2 teams in the UK, and you've got 2 teams in the US, you've got a time zone problem. You're not going to get everybody in the same room. Well, that would cost a lot of money. You can do that as well, but that costs a lot of money. So what are you going to do? Well, we're going to have a group of people get together, and that doesn't say integration team. It says Nexus. And the reason it says Nexus is it's that idea of it's a team of teams, so the right people for this particular sprint should be the ones that attend. So it might not be the same people every sprint, but you want the right people. But we don't want to tell you who those right people are. Yeah? You guys need to figure that out. That's part of the practice. This is the minimal we need. We know that a group of people have to get together and discuss dependencies before the sprint planning meetings. You need to make sure that that happens. And then we go through a much bigger, oh, I hit that twice. Yeah. A much bigger iterative cycle. I know this is a complicated diagram, but we discuss our Nexus dependencies at the Nexus level, feed that into the Scrum team sprint planning meeting, and maybe during that sprint planning meeting, they identify another dependency, and it has to go back to that group to then feed information into another team. So you have to kind of go around that cycle, and maybe that takes a large period of time. Maybe that's 48 hours, because you've got teams across the world. Maybe you can do it in much less if you've got everybody in the one location. But if it's across multiple time zones, you're going to have to, you do your event in the US, then you do, no, it'll be the other way around. You do your event in India, then you do your event in the UK, then you do your event in the US, and the US guys find a problem that one of the Indian teams has to deal with, so you have to feed that back, and they have to have another get-together to figure that out. So it could take a longer period of time. That's just what we have to deal with. Yeah, and we end up with a bunch of sprint backlogs, our Nexus sprint backlog, which is everything, and a bunch of sprint goals, because each team's going to have their own goal. We have a Nexus goal that everybody's going in the same direction, and then each team will have a goal that goes to achieving the Nexus goal. Sounds like a lot of work, doesn't it? But these are the things that we have to do in order to make multiple teams working together a success. We're just defining, yes, you should do these things. Don't forget this list of stuff that you have to do. There are probably going to be other things you need to do, but at least remember to do these things. So we have that goal to help us all going in the same direction. I've seen this sprint planning take many different facets. I've seen people do it individually. Teams go off and they just all do them individually, and then they get together every now and again. I've seen this model, which is you actually get everybody in a room and have video conferencing software to talk to the remote teams who are meeting at the same time, because maybe the time zones aren't that bad. I would say you'd be pretty lucky in the modern world if you can do this, because you've got everybody in one location. A customer I'm working with at the moment in Denver has most of their teams in one location in Denver. They have one team in, I don't know, somewhere else in the US, and one team in India. So most of their teams can get in at the same time. And then you've got that integration team in the middle that gets together. The board that I showed you earlier with the dependencies, keep it updated. People, a big room, collaborative room, where everybody's working together to figure out what those things are, and they end up with a backlog at the end. What are we going to do in this iteration? So what they end up with is the Nexus sprint backlog, which is everything you're going to do. Your entire plan. So that's going to be quite a lot of work if you've got 9 teams. And in that Nexus sprint backlog, we do need to understand dependencies as well, because we might have things that crop up during the iteration. Hopefully you don't have cross-team dependencies inside of your sprint. That kind of difficult, but you might just be reality. Here's the amount of work we've got to do, and we have to figure out what those things are. So your Scrum board looks a little bit more complicated, so hopefully you have a digital tool. Maybe if you get 3 teams, you can figure out how to do it on a whiteboard, but if you've got more than that, it's going to be a lot more difficult. A lot more difficult. I think I've got a few minutes left. Cool. We have our daily Scrum as well. We need to have the right people get together at the beginning of that to, again, feedback for things that happened during the last 24 hours, or probably 48 if we've got teams all over the world. Make sure we take into account those things that are happening in other teams that are important, that affect us. If integration is difficult, that's going to be a problem. So we need to share that knowledge. And then my favorite one is the sprint review, because most people believe that they should have separate sprint reviews. Well, we've got 10 teams, so we should have 10 different reviews, and they're all reviewing their own thing. But where's the single working piece of software that you can choose to ship at the end of that? It might not be there. You need to make sure that that thing is there, which is why in the Nexus guide it talks about a single review at the end. Now, that doesn't mean you get everybody together, although you can. Have you ever tried to get 20, 30 teams together for a single review? Anybody done that? It's kind of fun. One of the best ways to do that is the idea of the science fair idea that they have in the US, or even like we have today at the conference. If you go down into the, I don't know what they call that bit in the middle, the pit. Oh, it's that way, the pit. You'll be able to choose which vendors you go talk to. You can go and see Schlumberger, you can go and see Kongsberg, you can go and see Text Control and DevExpress. You just walk up to the booth and what have you got to show me? That works for reviews as well, because the purpose of a review is to get feedback. That's its purpose. You might or might not do a demo, but if you have like a little stand for your team and stakeholders are walking through the room and they can go where they care, so you get feedback from people who actually care about the things that you're building. Another way to do that is not to do a demo at all. Just do feedback. But then how do people see what you've been working on? Well, maybe you create little videos of what you've been working on in the sprint and ship that out before the end of the sprint so all of the stakeholders can watch the videos they care about. That's what Microsoft do. The VSTS, Visual Studio Team Services team, have about 70 teams working on their one product, and each of those 70 teams at the end of the iteration creates a little video, and an email goes out with, here's all of the videos that all of the teams have been working on, plus their probably their sprint goal as well. And stakeholders aren't going to watch them all, because that would kind of suck. There'd be a lot of time, but they're only short. But if I care about this topic, and I care about that topic, and I care about this other topic, I can go and watch those videos and then type them up a bunch of feedback and send it to them. So that they get that feedback, because that's the important thing. It's our Kaizen moment for our product. We have a retrospective, but again, it's more complicated. We've got problems that one team might have encountered that another team has solved. We've got problems that the integration team might have encountered that everybody needs to think about. So how do we make sure that everybody has that information? And then once we've had our retrospective, maybe there's lots of interesting solutions to those problems that we need to pull together and figure out what we're going to do at the Nexus level, at the entire group of people working together. So then we can have 2 little events in between. Again, it's probably 48 hours because we've got teams across the world. And we want to maintain some kind of, maybe a board that shows across all of our teams what we're planning to do, what we've decided, so that we can maintain a single place to do that. Now, maybe you need a tool for that if you're across multiple locations, but having some kind of board is probably a good idea. And then we get to an interesting topic. Has anybody heard in Scrum that we have one product owner? Okay. What happens if you've got 600 people working on a product? Can that one product owner really understand everything that's going on in the backlog? So I want to introduce a little caveat. Hopefully you can get away with one product owner. You as the product owner have 10% of the team's time. If you have 10 teams, then you've got 10% of 10 teams' time. So maybe that's good enough. Or maybe it's still far too complicated. Maybe you need multiple product owners, and that's something that, again, VSTS team do. Each team has a product owner. Or a product owner has 1 or more teams. I'll put it that way. So source control might have a product owner, and he has 2 teams. Work item tracking might have a product owner, and they have 1 team or 2 teams. Yeah. And then that product owner rolls up to an Uber product owner, which, yeah. So you might have a chief product owner. Sounds a little bit weird. I don't like that model, but it is a complementary practice. It's not one I would encourage unless you're absolutely massive. It's not a good thing to do because you've got levels of fusion between the chief product owner and the development teams. The more levels of fusion you have, the less likely you are to get the right message through. That's the whole the telephone game. Then the message changes as it goes. So there's a couple of other complementary practices that I do want to mention. One is A/B testing. Get A/B testing into your product. Have some way to do that. That's an engineering problem to go solve. If you're an engineer in the room, you should be able to figure that out. And have some way. You know, we might not know what feature to build. We don't know what feature to build. Or we might have a choice. Should we build it this way or that way? Maybe you have to build both and let the users decide. Which one do you prefer? It's something that if you look at, if you use Google and you're logged in, you find that the names of some of the buttons change on a fairly regular basis, and they also move around at the top of the screen. And they're doing that to gather data on, well, if we put this here, do more people click it? Okay, well, if we put that there, do more people click it or do less people click it? And they figure out. Amazon do it all the time as well. It's really important for them because they're more consumer-orientated. But even for business to business, if you have users using your product and they can't find the options that they need, they're not going to click them. So how do you know where to put stuff and how to do that? A/B testing, live monitors. One feature that I actually hate this practice when products do it to me, and that's the fake door practice. I hate it. You know when you go into a product and you click a button and it says, coming soon. It's called a fake door. They're potentially recording how many people click that button so that the product owner can see whether it's worth investing in that part of the product. People, ooh, yeah, I'd like that feature. Click, click, click. But from a user's perspective, click, coming soon. Ah, I thought it had that feature. Yeah, it frustrates me. But doing things like user voice, I know many people are moving towards using user voice to glean much more insight into what their customers want. Microsoft have it for a lot of their products. They use user voice, visualstudio.uservoice.com. I know many of my customers are using it as well. Having some kind of build automation is obviously going to be fairly important. That's how you provide that quick feedback, get stuff out, and figure out what they're using. Oh, I hate it when that happens. One of the key things that I think, again, people forget is about testing and automation, but not just unit testing. Unit testing is easy to automate. That's all within the control of the developer. But automated acceptance testing is also of paramount importance, because the number of tests that you have are going to multiply sprint on sprint. Each sprint, you've got more tests. Do you have time to run them all? Do you have time to run your full regression? Because if you don't, you're going to miss something as things change over time. So there's potentially going to be faults in the product. So if you automate everything, then you can get to that place of having everything there. So one last thing, and I know it's close to some of my customers' heart, which is internal open source. If you've got a large organization with lots of different products being built, don't let everybody create their own logging framework, because then you've just got a million logging frameworks that maybe don't fit the need. Have some way to have an internal open source idea where even if, well, use open source if you can. If you're creating stuff internally, internal open source is really important to share knowledge even within your organization. Don't keep everybody's code secret from each other. Be able to see what everybody else is working on, use some of the capabilities that they're building so that you're not ending up with too much of the same thing going on. So, are there any questions? Because everything was totally clear. Yes?
So if you had the exact opposite situation, so you're only 2 on the team, should we just throw Scrum out of the way?
So I would say if you've got 2 people in the team, why bother? Sit next to each other, build some software. That's, so can you do Scrum? Can you use Scrum? Sure, you can use Scrum. Can one person use Scrum? But I don't think it's worth it. It's just like if you've got 2 teams, can't you just get them to sit next to each other and talk to each other? But it's when you get to more that you need that extra overhead. But yeah, if you get 2 people, don't bother. That would be my recommendation for sure. Anybody else?
You mentioned the integration team.
Yes.
How does the daily work look like with the integration team? Which boards are they looking at? Do they have their own stand-ups?
So the question was, on a daily basis, how does the integration team work? Especially if they're distributed. So because they're team members on particular Scrum teams, yeah, and they're a member of a development team. So they have their day job, they have their daily Scrum, but potentially they have to help that team and other teams figure out how to make good, high-quality integrated product. So they probably have more expertise in build and integration and coaching. So they're helping people as well. But on a daily basis, I would expect them to be working in their teams and looking at that level as almost like a community of practice across all the teams in the Nexus, and then get together to discuss things as needed. So just as needed. I don't want to be specific and say, well, they have to meet at this time and they have to meet at that time. Everywhere where you see the Nexus on the diagram, that could be the Nexus integration team. Yeah? Anywhere where it says Nexus, it could be the Nexus integration team that are the group of people that meet, but they might not be the right people for that point in time or for that problem to solve. So it's okay for it to be somebody else. I don't know if I totally answered your question, but it's up to you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Yes? Yeah, Scrum of Scrums. Yep.
We as a Nexus integration team, is a group of Scrum Masters which belongs to all the teams, and they meet up and then discuss their problems. And then
yep.
When it comes to the backlog, we have a regular backlog for each team, and then we move the backlog. We have decided for a Nexus sprint backlog, so people know what's going on.
So you're using Scrum of Scrums. Scrum of Scrums, which is all the Scrum Masters get together and discuss the problems. I have seen that work. I've also seen it not work. I find you need a lot of discipline and highly skilled Scrum Masters who are into all of the different pieces in order to facilitate that. Now, when it says Nexus, it might be the Scrum Masters that get together. It's whoever is relevant to that discussion is the ones that turn up. Does that make sense? It's like open space rules.
And then the next slide, we have this product owners. We are having Scrum product owner in the team and the product owner in the top.
Yep.
Then a couple of product owners in the line, and then we have service owner. The service owner owns the service, entire service.
I'd try and minimize that stack. Are you saying that they've got the hierarchy of product owners, so that probably got a lot of teams working on the one product?
We have almost 7 teams.
7 teams? Yeah. So again, I would try and minimize that level of fusion. The more levels you have between the ideas and the people doing the work, the less likely they are to be the same thing. But if it's working for you and you're producing working software that's fully integrated and shippable on a regular cadence, then you're doing the right thing. Yeah? I wouldn't say that you're doing something wrong unless you're unable to ship working software, which is most of the customers that call me. So that helps. Any other? You had a question? Yes?
How would you handle the retrospectives with massive teams? Like you have 80 teams working on a project.
80?
80, for example.
Yep.
Talking about or big project. How would you handle it?
So
Still keep the single retrospective for each team and combine their feedback?
yeah, so the question was, how would you handle retrospectives if you've got 80 teams working on one product? Yes, they would all do their individual retrospectives. Nexus focuses very specifically on 3 to 9 teams, because above 9, how do you get representatives from 80 teams in a room? So I'd probably break those 80 teams down into a number of Nexus. Yeah, and each Nexus has those meetings, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't talk about around Nexus++, which is you've got many Nexus working together, and it's the same idea, just take it one level up. So representatives from each of the Nexus would get together at the next level up, to spread that knowledge. So it just becomes more complicated with 80 teams, for sure. Yeah, it's not easy. Each team has their own retrospective. Nexus meets before and after. So input, and then take the output, and maybe do something with it at the Nexus level. Yeah. Any other questions?
So you think this is going to work only when Nexus teams are professional Scrum teams? What if some teams are using Kanban, for example, with the same?
Yep, no, so that's a very good question. I don't care what they're doing inside of the teams, as long as they can professionally and consistently create working software of the required quality level at the end of each sprint. Yeah? Because the reality is that we're going to be on some sort of cadence. We have to have working software at some point in time. So even if you say you're doing Kanban as a team, you've still got that deliverable at the same time as everybody else. Now, does everybody have to be on the same cadence? Not necessarily. Ideally, yes, but you can't have one team on a 3-week cadence and another team on a 2-week cadence. That's not going to work for you. Yeah, because when do you actually have working software where everything's integrated? But if you have a 4-week cadence and you have some people on 2-week and some people on 1 week, that's going to work, because the math's going to work, if that makes sense. Yeah. So if you do have any questions, feel free to contact me on any of the methods you like up there. And thank you very much for coming. Thank you.